Hi everyone, welcome to the show. As you can see, my presentation is called Purely Evaluative Moral Realism, Ethics Without Obligations. But what I'm going to be talking about isn't an ethical theory, but a meta-ethical one. That means I'm not going to talk about which things are good or bad or right or wrong, but rather what those qualities actually are and whether they exist in the first place. And before I can tell you about this view I've developed, I want to tell you about how I came up with it, which means telling you about moral error theory. Is there anything wrong with stealing? And if there is, does that mean that you have a reason not to steal? The answers might seem obvious at first, but for philosophers, these aren't simple questions at all. In fact, one of the classic problems in meta-ethics is whether there are any objective moral facts. That is, whether there are facts of the matter about whether something is really good or bad or right or wrong. Facts that would be true whether or not we believed them. Moral realists say yes, there are, while moral error theorists say no, there aren't. They believe there are no moral properties and so no moral facts, and that all positive moral claims, that is, claims that something in the world really does have a quality like goodness or wrongness, are always false. This is a bold position, but it's one that's alarmingly well motivated. And moral error theorists usually back it up with something called the argument from queerness, which goes like this. If moral facts existed, they would be very strange in that they would be normative, that is, reason-giving, in a very particular way. Anything can be normative in the right circumstances, but moral facts are supposed to give us reasons that apply unconditionally to all agents. That means you, me, Genghis Khan, everybody, and it doesn't matter what our goals are or what we think about it. At the same time, we can explain all of our moral thoughts, feelings and actions naturalistically without invoking moral facts, and this kind of explanation for them would actually be better because we wouldn't have to explain the strange properties that moral facts are supposed to have. Now, we normally say we should only believe in the things that are posited by our best explanations of the world. That's why we shouldn't believe in Bigfoot or the Loch Ness Monster when we already believe in bad photography. So it seems like we shouldn't believe in moral facts. Oh dear. It was while thinking about this argument that I first came up with purely evaluative moral realism. Do all moral facts give us reasons in the way the argument from queerness says they do? Consider these two examples of possible moral facts. First, I ought morally not to steal. And second, stealing is morally bad. Now these are both distinctly moral claims, but they aren't the same claim, and in fact each seems to express very different kinds of idea. The top one is normative. It's concerned with our reasons and what we should or should not do, while the second is evaluative. It's concerned with goodness or badness and the extent of each. If this is right, then not all moral facts are normative in the strange way moral error theorists are worried about. Now, as long as morality as a whole entails the existence of some of these normative facts, the argument from queerness still works, which is why I thought, what would happen if we just stripped that element out? Purely evaluative moral realism, then, is the claim that there really are moral facts, but all of them are evaluative, are concerned with goodness and badness, but none of them are normative, concerned with reasons. So can we actually be purely evaluative moral realists? That is, does this view make sense? If purely evaluative moral realism were true, it would mean that of the two claims I discussed before, I ought morally not to steal, and stealing is morally bad, one could be true while the other is false. And specifically it would mean combinations like stealing is morally bad, but I have no moral reason not to steal, could be true. Now, it doesn't mean that they would have to be true. In fact, I think most people do have moral reasons, just not of the strange kind moral error theorists are worried about. They'd be more like the reasons they have to do anything else. But the fact remains that this sort of combination would be possible under purely evaluative moral realism. Does that make sense? Is this a claim we can reasonably make? Purely evaluative moral realism could only be correct if the answer is yes. So a lot of my research has been looking at arguments to the effect that the answer might be no, that claims like stealing is morally bad, but I have no moral reason not to steal, couldn't be true. Now, we don't have time for me to explore any of these arguments in depth, but suffice it to say, I haven't found any that really impressed me. This doesn't necessarily mean that purely evaluative moral realism is right, but it does mean that it's plausible enough to stand alongside existing options like more conventional moral realism and moral error theory. This is important because if it did turn out to be true, it would have some very interesting implications. Let's start with the bad news, which is a not very philosophical way of saying with what would follow if purely evaluative moral realism were true, which might put people off the theory. First of all, it seems like under this view, morality doesn't tell us why we should care about morality, or really tell us what to do at all. But I wonder whether it needs to. Maybe it's enough, or even the point of morality, to tell us how to be good, rather than to tell us to be good in the first place. I think there might be quite a lot of people who need help with the former, but very few who need convincing of the latter. And I think it might be a fool's errand to try to convince people who don't care at all from the beginning about what's good or bad. Speaking of which, the other troubling implication is that under purely evaluative moral realism, people who don't care about morality at all genuinely don't have reasons not to do bad things. This is more than a little counterintuitive, and while this next point isn't a very philosophical reason, it's easy to see why you might not want it to be true. But this might be the price we pay for the good news, that is, all the theoretical benefits we would reap if purely evaluative moral realism did turn out to be true. First of all, it would mean morality can still exist, there can still be moral facts, even if we accept the argument from queerness. That was my goal when I first came up with this view, so good job me, mission accomplished. And secondly, it would do away with what's called the is-ought problem. Philosophers have long struggled with the question of how what is good is connected with what we ought to do, but purely evaluative moral realists can sidestep this issue entirely because they don't posit oughts in the first place. Now, some of the views I've considered in my research that suggest that purely evaluative moral realism couldn't be true also offer solutions to this problem by showing some kind of connection between the ideas of goodness and oughtness. But dissolving a problem is at least as good as solving it, so this is still a point in purely evaluative moral realism's favour. Finally, it has some interesting implications for the connection between free will and ethics. If you deny the existence of free will, which some philosophers do, then it seems to contradict a lot of what we'd say in ethics, because it means that people can only ever do whatever it is that they actually do. And because you can only say that someone ought to do something that they actually can do, it seems nonsensical to claim that they ought to do anything other than they actually end up doing. But a purely evaluative moral realist doesn't run into this problem. They only need to talk about how good or bad a person's actions are. So, even if it turns out that there is no such thing as free will, a purely evaluative understanding of ethics would lose nothing. So it looks like purely evaluative moral realism not only resolves the worries of many moral error theorists, but also does away with some long-standing puzzles for ethicists, and this makes it very much worthy of consideration alongside more conventional metaethical views. That was the whole presentation, so thanks for listening.